Elias Thorne was the architectural equivalent of St. Jude's Academy. Rigid, historical, meticulously groomed, and entirely obsessed with tradition. As head boy, his life was a sequence of color-coded schedules, perfectly knotted ties, and an unyielding pursuit of early admission to Oxford. He possessed a terrifyingly precise memory and a complete inability to tolerate chaos. Then came Maeve Lynn. Maeve was a mid-year transfer student who treated the centuries-old dress code as a mere suggestion, constantly had charcoal smudges on her cheekbones, and possessed a laugh that echoed far too loudly in the quiet, hallowed halls of the academy. She was a walking disruption to Elias's perfectly calculated universe, and from the moment she accidentally spilled her aggressively vibrant pomegranate tea all over his impeccably stark, white debate notes on her second day, a visceral, deeply academic warfare was silently declared between them. The warfare escalated from sharp glares across the AP Calculus classroom to full-blown sabotage during the Model United Nations Conference, culminating in a catastrophic shouting match in the middle of the school's ancient library. The headmaster, a man who possessed zero tolerance for public emotional displays, did not give them detention. Instead, he handed them the keys to the subterranean school archives. It was a windowless, cavernous basement filled with decades of unsorted, rotting historical documents, forgotten blueprints, and a layer of dust so thick it felt like snow. Their sentence was absolute. They were to spend 3 hours every single afternoon in the freezing basement, cataloging the entire history of St. Jude's until the end of the semester. If they failed, or if they killed each other, they would both be stripped of their leadership roles and academic standing. They were locked in a dusty tomb together, fueled entirely by mutual, suffocating resentment. For the first 2 weeks, the archives operated under a state of heavily armed silence. Elias claimed the heavy oak desk on the left, organizing enrollment records from the 1950s with algorithmic precision, his posture terrifyingly straight. Maeve claimed the crumbling leather sofa on the right, cross-legged, haphazardly sorting through boxes of old student letters and photographs, occasionally letting out a dramatic sigh just to watch a muscle tick in Elias's jaw. They communicated exclusively through passive-aggressive post-it notes slapped onto boxes. Elias would leave a perfectly printed blue note reading, "Please refrain from breathing so loudly. It disrupts the structural integrity of the paper." Maeve would stick a neon pink note directly over it reading, "If you pull that stick out of your spine, you might actually enjoy oxygen." It was an agonizing battle of wills, both determined to break the other's resolve through sheer, stubborn endurance. The turning point arrived on a Tuesday in November when a sudden, violent thunderstorm knocked out the power grid for the entire campus. The subterranean archive plunged into an absolute, suffocating darkness. Elias, whose entire life was predicated on control, immediately froze, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He hated the dark. It was unorganized and unpredictable. Before panic could fully set in, the warm, golden glow of a heavy-duty flashlight cut through the blackness. Maeve was standing near the breaker box, the light illuminating the sharp curve of her jaw and the paint stains on her cuffs. She didn't mock him. She didn't make a sarcastic comment about the head boy being afraid of the dark. She simply walked over, set the flashlight on the table so the beam bounced off the ceiling to illuminate the room, and slid a remarkably terrible, half-crushed granola bar across the oak desk toward him. "Eat it, Thorne," she said quietly. "Your blood sugar is crashing, and I refuse to carry your unconscious body up 3 flights of stairs." The shared silence in the flashlight's glow shifted the atmosphere from hostile to tentatively observant. To pass the time while waiting for the generators to kick in, Maeve pulled a small, incredibly deteriorated leather-bound diary from the box she had been sorting. It belonged to a student from 1922 named Arthur. As she began to read the entries aloud, her voice losing its usual sharp edge and adopting a soft, reverent cadence, Elias found himself unexpectedly captivated. Arthur wasn't writing about academics. He was writing about a secret, agonizingly hidden romance with another boy at the academy, conducting their relationship in the very shadows of the archive room they were currently sitting in. For the first time, Elias didn't look at Maeve as a disruption. He looked at her as a storyteller. When she finished the final, heartbreaking entry about Arthur leaving for the war, Elias realized he had leaned entirely across his desk, completely drawn into her orbit. When the lights finally flickered back to life, the hostility was gone, replaced by a strange, fragile truce. They didn't return to their separate corners. The next afternoon, without a word, Maeve dragged her box of photographs over to Elias's oak desk. Elias, in a massive departure from his usual territorial behavior, silently cleared a space for her among his perfectly stacked files. The post-it notes vanished. Instead, they began to actually speak. Elias learned that Maeve's chaotic exterior masked a brilliant, fiercely observant mind. She could date a photograph just by looking at the style of the lapels and the exposure of the film. Maeve learned that Elias's rigidity wasn't arrogance, but a desperate coping mechanism for the crushing, suffocating pressure his politically prominent family placed on his shoulders. They were two intensely lonely people who had built completely different armors, slowly realizing they were fighting the exact same war. It was the subtle things that started to unravel Elias's carefully constructed composure. It was the way Maeve hummed an off-key indie rock song when she found a particularly interesting historical artifact. It was the way she chewed on the end of her pencil, leaving a ring of indentations in the yellow wood. One late Friday afternoon, a single shaft of late autumn sunlight managed to pierce through the tiny, grimy window near the ceiling, illuminating a swirling vortex of dust motes. Maeve stepped into the light, raising a hand to try and catch the floating particles, her dark hair catching the golden hue, her face completely relaxed and ethereal. Elias stopped cataloging. He sat entirely frozen, a massive, terrifying realization crashing over him with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't just tolerating her presence anymore. He was anticipating it. He was looking at her, really looking at her, and realizing he was dangerously, hopelessly captivated. Their historical cataloging suddenly morphed into an active investigation. Maeve discovered a set of original, hand-drawn blueprints of the Academy that didn't match the current structural layout. There was a large, unaccounted-for empty space detailed directly behind the northern wall of the archive room. Elias's encyclopedic knowledge of the school's history confirmed that no renovations had ever been recorded in that sector. The mystery instantly bound them together in a thrilling, clandestine conspiracy. They spent hours comparing old headmaster logs with the architectural lines, their heads bent together over the fragile paper. Elias could smell the faint scent of vanilla and old paper that clung to Maeve, and every time her shoulder brushed against his as she pointed to a discrepancy, a sharp, electric jolt traveled straight up his spine, short-circuiting his usually flawless logic. Driven by an intoxicating mix of historical curiosity and adrenaline, they decided to physically test the blueprints. Armed with the heavy handle of a broken broom they found in a utility closet, Elias began to systematically tap against the northern stone wall, listening for hollow echoes. Maeve stood right behind him, holding the flashlight, her breath ghosting warmly against the back of his neck, making it impossible for him to focus on the acoustic resonance of the stone. "You're tapping too softly, Thorn," she whispered, stepping even closer, her hand coming up to cover his on the wooden handle. Her fingers were warm and calloused from holding paintbrushes. "You have to strike it like you actually want to break something for once in your life." Guided by her hand, Elias struck the stone hard. A deep, hollow reverberation echoed through the basement. They locked eyes in the dim light, the space between them suddenly feeling suffocatingly small and impossibly charged. It took them 3 days of painstaking, secret labor to chip away the crumbling mortar hiding the edges of a concealed iron door. They worked in tandem, passing tools back and forth, communicating in low, breathless whispers so the janitorial staff wouldn't hear them. Elias found himself distracted by the way the physical exertion made a light flush creep up Maeve's neck. When they finally managed to pry the heavy iron hinges open, the door screamed in protest, revealing a narrow, pitch-black passageway smelling of damp earth and preserved history. Elias instinctively reached out, grabbing Maeve's hand to stop her from stepping immediately into the unknown darkness. His grip was tight, protective. Maeve looked down at their intertwined fingers, then up at his face, her usual sarcasm nowhere to be found. "I'm not going to fall, Elias," she said softly. He didn't let go. "I know," he replied, his voice rough. "But I am." The passageway led to a perfectly preserved, secret Victorian-era library. It was small, circular, and lined floor-to-ceiling with rare first editions, locked glass display cases, and an ornate stained glass skylight that had been tarred over from the outside. It was a breathtaking discovery, a forgotten piece of the Academy's soul. As they stepped into the center of the room, their flashlights sweeping over the gold leaf lettering on the spines of the books, Maeve let out a soft gasp of absolute wonder. She turned to Elias, her eyes shining with tears of sheer artistic appreciation, and without thinking, she threw her arms around his neck in a massive, overwhelming hug. Elias froze for a fraction of a second before his arms automatically banded around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. He buried his face in her hair, breathing her in, terrifyingly aware that he never wanted to let her go. The secret library became their private universe. They stopped cataloging the main archive and spent every spare moment in the hidden room, poring over the rare texts and piecing together why the room had been sealed shut in the 1920s. The academic rivalry was entirely dead, replaced by a profound, intimate intellectual partnership. They started sneaking into the school after hours, bypassing the security system with Elias's master codes. During these midnight sessions, sitting on the plush, dusty velvet rug in the center of the room, the boundaries completely blurred. They shared deeply personal secrets, May's fear of never leaving a permanent mark on the world, and Elias's crippling anxiety about failing his family's impossible legacy. In the quiet darkness, surrounded by forgotten history, they were dismantling each other's defenses piece by piece, building a foundation of absolute, undeniable trust. One late night, while reaching for a particularly high volume on poetry, the rolling wooden ladder Maeve was standing on abruptly hitched on an uneven floorboard. She slipped, crying out as she lost her balance. Elias moved with a speed he didn't know he possessed, catching her directly in his arms before she hit the ground. The momentum sent them both crashing to the soft velvet rug, Elias twisting his body to take the brunt of the impact. They ended up in a tangle of limbs, Maeve sprawled directly on top of him, her hands braced on his chest. He was breathing heavily, his heart hammering violently against her palms. She looked down at him, her dark eyes wide and incredibly dark in the dim light. The banter died. The air thickened. Elias's gaze dropped to her mouth, his hand slowly coming up to brush a stray lock of hair behind her ear. He pulled her a fraction of an inch closer, the inevitable gravity taking over. Just as their lips were mere millimeters apart, the harsh, grating sound of the heavy archive door opening upstairs echoed down the passageway. The beam of a security flashlight sliced through the darkness of the main basement. Panic instantly shattered the electric tension. Elias clamped a hand over Maeve's mouth, pulling her tightly against him on the floor, dragging them both behind a massive oak display case. They lay perfectly still, holding their breath, their bodies pressed flush together from chest to knee. Elias could feel the frantic, terrified racing of Maeve's heart mirroring his own. They waited in agonizing silence for 10 minutes until the security guard finally locked the main door and moved on. When the silence returned, the romantic spell had been broken by pure adrenaline, but the physical memory of how perfectly she fit against him was branded permanently into Elias's nervous system. The near kiss and the near discovery triggered a massive internal panic within Elias. His rigidly structured mind could not process the overwhelming, chaotic depth of his feelings for Maeve. In a cowardly attempt to regain control, he implemented the avoidance protocol. For the next 3 days, he reverted to his cold, professional head boy persona. He sat at the oak desk in the main archive, focused solely on the paperwork, and refused to go into the hidden library with her. He answered her questions with clipped, monosyllabic responses and avoided eye contact at all costs. Maeve, deeply hurt and intensely confused by the sudden, freezing withdrawal, retreated to the crumbling leather sofa. She watched him build his ice walls back up, her chest aching with a rejection he hadn't even voiced, wondering if she had entirely imagined the profound connection they had shared in the dark. By Friday, Maeve had reached her breaking point. She was a girl of action, not passive suffering. She marched over to the oak desk, slammed her hands down flat on the wood, and forcefully closed the ledger Elias was currently reading. He looked up, his jaw set, trying to maintain his icy facade. I am not a math problem. You can just file away when it gets too complicated, Elias, Maeve said, her voice trembling with a potent mixture of anger and raw vulnerability. If you want to go back to hating me, fine. But you do not get to look at me the way you did, hold me the way you did, and then pretend I don't exist because you're too much of a coward to deal with it. She didn't wait for his response. She turned on her heel, grabbed her backpack, and walked out of the archive room, leaving Elias staring at the closed door, the silence in the room suddenly feeling unbearable and deeply wrong. Maeve didn't show up for archive duty on Monday or Tuesday. She had gone to the headmaster and requested an alternative punishment, claiming they had irreconcilable differences. Elias sat alone in the vast, dusty basement, the silence deafening. The perfectly organized files brought him absolutely no satisfaction. He looked at the empty leather sofa, and then at the concealed iron door leading to their secret library, and realized with terrifying clarity that his perfectly structured, predictable world was entirely meaningless without her chaotic brilliance in it. He had tried to protect himself from the unpredictability of falling in love, and in doing so, he had driven away the only person who had ever made him feel like he could actually breathe. The panic of losing control was nothing compared to the absolute, crushing devastation of losing Maeve. Elias knew a simple apology wouldn't fix the damage he had done. He needed a gesture that proved he was willing to step out of his rigid safety zone. He spent Wednesday night doing something highly illegal and deeply uncharacteristic. He scaled the exterior brick wall of the academy to access the roof. He carried with him a small, intricate glass lantern he had found in the secret library, cleaning it meticulously and filling it with fairy lights. He carefully lowered the illuminated lantern down the chimney shaft that connected to the sealed skylight of the hidden room, creating a brilliant, glowing beacon in the dark space they had claimed as their own. It was a massive breach of protocol, a reckless act of romantic vandalism designed entirely to show her he was ready to break the rules for her. The next morning, Elias slipped a pristine, white envelope into the vents of Maeve's locker. Inside was a single piece of archival parchment, written not in his usual perfectly printed block letters, but in a slightly messy, hurried script. I was terrified. I am still terrified. But sitting in a perfectly organized room without you is worse than any chaos you could ever bring into my life. Please meet me at the iron door at 4 o'clock. I left a light on for you. He spent the rest of the school day in a state of agonizing nausea. Unable to focus on calculus or prefect duties, his entire existence narrowed down to the ticking hands of the clock and the terrifying possibility that his apology was too late. At exactly 4 p.m., Elias stood in front of the concealed iron door in the basement. His hands were sweating, his usually perfect tie loosened in a state of nervous disarray. At 4:05, the heavy wooden door at the top of the stairs creaked open. Maeve walked down slowly. She looked guarded, her arms crossed defensively over her chest. She didn't say anything as she approached him, stopping a few feet away. Elias took a deep breath, his heart hammering against his ribs. He didn't offer excuses or try to rationalize his behavior. He looked her directly in the eyes, stripping away every ounce of his head boy armor. I am profoundly sorry, he whispered, his voice incredibly raw. I panicked because I realized I don't care about Oxford or my family's legacy or the rules of this school as much as I care about you. And that terrified me. Maeve's defensive posture slowly melted. She searched his face, looking for the familiar icy distance, but found only a desperate, terrified sincerity. Without a word, she stepped past him and pushed open the heavy iron door. She walked down the short passageway and stopped at the threshold of the secret library. She looked up. The glass lantern Elias had lowered down the chimney was suspended above the center of the room, casting a warm, magical, starry glow over the dusty velvet and the antique spines of the books. It was breathtaking. It was a piece of chaotic, rule-breaking art executed with Elias's signature precision. She turned back to look at him, tears shimmering in her dark eyes, a slow, devastatingly beautiful smile breaking across her face. You vandalized a historical building for me, Thorn, she whispered. Elias closed the distance between them, stepping into the secret library and bathing in the warm light of the lantern. I would burn the entire building down if it meant you would look at me like that again, he confessed, the truth of the statement surprising even him. He didn't hesitate this time. He didn't think about the consequences or the rules or the terrifying lack of control. He reached out, framing her face with both hands, his thumbs gently wiping away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. Maeve let out a soft, shuddering breath, her hands coming up to grip his wrists, anchoring him to her. When he finally leaned down and kissed her, it wasn't hesitant. It was a desperate, consuming surrender. It was the collision of order and chaos, melting into absolute, perfect clarity in the dusty, forgotten heart of the school. Their relationship blossomed in the absolute secrecy of the archive basement. To the rest of the school, they were still the head boy and the chaotic transfer student, maintaining a professional, slightly frosty distance in the hallways. But the moment the heavy basement door clicked shut, the facade completely vanished. Elias found himself laughing, actual, deep, genuine laughter, at Maeve's sharp, cynical observations about the teaching staff. Maeve found herself sitting patiently, her head resting on Elias's shoulder, as he excitedly explained the geopolitical nuances of a historical treaty they found in the secret library. They balanced each other perfectly. He gave her a safe, grounded foundation, and she gave him the permission to actually feel alive, to break the incredibly strict parameters he had built around his own existence. The romantic bliss was violently interrupted 3 weeks before the end of the semester. Elias, in his capacity as head boy, was asked to attend a budgetary meeting with the school board. During the meeting, a wealthy developer presented a plan to completely demolish the structurally unsound northern wing of the basement, which included the archive room and the undiscovered secret library, to build a state-of-the-art, aggressively modern athletic center. The board, blinded by the massive financial donation attached to the project, voted to approve the demolition, scheduling the construction crews to arrive the week after graduation. Elias sat at the mahogany boardroom table, his blood running cold, realizing that the physical manifestation of their entire relationship, the sanctuary that held their secrets and the academy's hidden soul, was about to be completely obliterated. Elias broke the news to Maeve in the secret library. She was devastated, pacing the small, circular room like a trapped animal, tracing her fingers over the spines of the rare books. "We can't just let them pour concrete over this," she insisted, her eyes flashing with a fierce, protective fire. "This is history. This is ours." Elias agreed. They transformed their romantic sanctuary into a war room. The objective was clear. They had to legally and publicly prove the historical and architectural significance of the hidden library to block the demolition permit. They worked tirelessly, spending every waking hour cross-referencing property deeds, historical landmark codes, and the diary of Arthur, who, they discovered, had been the son of the original architect and had hidden the library to protect a collection of banned, radical literature from a puritanical headmaster in the 1920s. The pressure of the impending deadline began to severely strain their newly formed bond. Elias, reverting to his stress-induced coping mechanisms, became intensely micromanaging, snapping at Maeve when she misfiled a document or lost focus. Maeve, feeling suffocated by his sudden rigidity, began to push back, intentionally leaving her research scattered just to annoy him. Late one night, the tension finally boiled over into a shouting match. "I am trying to save the only thing that matters, Maeve," Elias yelled, slamming a heavy law book onto the desk. "You're trying to control everything because you're terrified of failing." Maeve fired back, her voice equally loud. "You can't treat me like one of your subordinates just because you're stressed. I am your partner." The silence that followed was heavy and miserable, the ghosts of their old rivalry rearing their ugly heads in the face of absolute exhaustion. Maeve stormed out of the basement, running out into a massive, torrential downpour. Elias stood frozen for a moment before his heart overrode his wounded pride. He sprinted after her, catching up to her near the iron gates of the academy. He grabbed her arm, spinning her around in the pouring rain. They were both soaked to the bone, the cold water plastering their clothes to their skin. "You're right," Elias shouted over the roar of the rain, gripping her shoulders. "I'm terrified. I'm terrified of losing the library, and I'm terrified of losing you, and I am entirely incapable of handling this without you. Please don't walk away." Maeve looked at his desperate, rain-slicked face, the anger draining out of her instantly. She stepped forward, wrapping her arms around his waist, burying her face in his wet chest. "I'm not going anywhere, Elias," she promised. "We save it together." They compiled a massive, irrefutable dossier detailing the historical significance of the secret library, complete with original blueprints, Arthur's diary entries, and legal precedent for historical landmark protection. The only way to stop the demolition was to bypass the school board entirely and present the findings directly to the Historical Preservation Society and the Alumni Association during the final, highly attended Founders' Day assembly. It was a massive gamble. If they failed, Elias would be stripped of his valedictorian status for insubordination, and Maeve would likely face suspension. As they stood backstage behind the heavy velvet curtains, listening to the headmaster drone on about the new athletic center, Elias reached out and tightly grabbed Maeve's hand. His palm was sweating, but his resolve was absolute. They were about to blow up the entire established order of St. Jude's Academy. When the headmaster paused for applause, Elias and Maeve walked out onto the stage together. The murmur of confusion in the massive auditorium was deafening. Elias didn't use his pristine, approved speech notes. He stepped up to the microphone, his posture rigid but his voice ringing with a passionate, undeniable authority. He spoke about the true history of the academy, not the sanitized version the board preferred. He introduced Maeve, who projected the high-resolution photographs of the secret library, the rare books, and the stained glass skylight onto the massive screen behind them. She read a passage from Arthur's diary, her voice carrying the emotional weight of a forgotten century. They exposed the hidden room, the banned literature, and the profound, beautiful history that the school board was preparing to destroy for a basketball court. The presentation created absolute chaos. The Alumni Association was outraged by the board's destructive plans. The Historical Preservation Society immediately filed an emergency injunction to halt any demolition on the campus pending a full investigation. The headmaster was furious, but he was entirely powerless against the massive wave of public and financial pressure from the alumni. Elias and Maeve were pulled into the administration office for a terrifying, 3-hour disciplinary hearing. They sat side by side in the uncomfortable leather chairs, their hands linked tightly beneath the mahogany desk, presenting a completely united, unyielding front. They refused to apologize for exposing the truth. They had wagered their entire academic futures on the preservation of the secret library, and as they walked out of the office, exhausted but utterly unbroken, they knew they had successfully started a war they were absolutely going to win. 2 weeks later, on the morning of their graduation, the official ruling came down from the city council. The northern wing of the St. Jude's basement, including the main archive and the secret library, was officially designated as a protected historical landmark. The demolition was permanently canceled. The school board was forced to pivot, announcing a massive fundraising campaign to restore the secret library and open it to the students as a specialized historical research center. When Elias read the official email on his phone, he was standing in the chaotic, bustling hallway, wearing his graduation robes. He looked across the sea of students and locked eyes with Maeve. She was beaming, a genuinely radiant, triumphant smile that lit up the entire corridor. He pushed through the crowd, uncaring of who was watching, picked her up by the waist, and spun her around in a circle of pure, unadulterated victory. Elias gave the valedictory address later that afternoon. He stood at the podium, looking out over his peers, his family, and the faculty. He didn't deliver the sterile, perfectly calculated speech his parents had helped him write months ago. He spoke about the danger of rigid adherence to tradition and the absolute necessity of embracing the unpredictable chaos of discovery. He spoke about finding history in the dark and finding the courage to protect the things that truly matter. He didn't name Maeve directly, but he looked right at her sitting in the front row, his voice softening, the emotion clear in his eyes as he spoke about how the most profound, life-altering lessons are rarely found in a textbook, but rather in the unexpected people who challenge you to tear down your own walls. After the ceremony, while the rest of the graduating class was celebrating on the pristine front lawns with their families, Elias and Maeve slipped away. They walked down the familiar, dimly lit stairs into the basement archive. The room felt different now. It wasn't a punishment or a tomb anymore. It was a monument to their victory. They walked past the oak desk and the crumbling leather sofa, pushing open the heavy iron door to step into the secret library. The glass lantern Elias had lowered down the chimney was still there, catching the late afternoon sunlight filtering through the now uncovered stained glass skylight. They stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the rare books they had saved, the dust motes dancing in the colorful light, feeling the profound, heavy weight of the history they had preserved and the history they had created together. "So," Maeve said, breaking the quiet reverence of the room, turning to face him. She was wearing her graduation gown over a heavily paint-splattered dress, looking perfectly, beautifully chaotic. "You're going to Oxford. I'm going to art school in Chicago. That's a massive, terrifying ocean between us, Thorn." Elias stepped closer, reaching out to gently trace the line of her jaw, his dark eyes filled with absolute, unwavering certainty. "I spent my entire life being terrified of the unpredictable, Maeve," he whispered softly. "I'm not terrified anymore. An ocean is just logistics. I will fly, I will swim, I will build a boat out of these terrible historical ledgers if I have to. You are the best, most beautiful disruption that has ever happened to my meticulously planned life, and I am absolutely refusing to let you go." Maeve's breath hitched, a single tear escaping to slide down her cheek, completely overwhelmed by the profound depth of his devotion. She wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him down, and kissed him with everything she had. It was a kiss that held the memory of the freezing, dark basement, the adrenaline of the near discoveries, the exhaustion of the fight, and the absolute, triumphant joy of the victory. They were standing in a room built to hide secrets, but there was nothing hidden between them anymore. As they finally pulled apart, leaning their foreheads together in the quiet, colorful light of the preserved library, Elias realized he had failed his original archive sentence entirely. He hadn't just organized the history of St. Jude's. He had allowed Maeve Lynn to completely rewrite the entire blueprint of his heart.